Lot to think about, Dr. Devy. Dr. Parasuraman, would you like to both respond and tell us your take on this?
Thank you. Good evening. Of course, the language is an integral part of a cultural whole, and so is the ecosystem in which the groups exist, where they have their livelihoods, they have their resource base, which provides them the sustenance and also nurtures the language and thus the culture. I think what we have seen in the last, I think 150 years, I think with the advent of colonialism in this country, is that there has been systematic alienation of the tribal people from their ecosystem, from their livelihoods. For instance, if we were to look at the post-independence history of India, out of about 60 million people who have been displaced by very many developmental projects, about 65% of all of them are tribal people actually. And tribal people actually constitute only about 7.5% of India's population. And so what is happening is that there has been systematic alienation of people from their lands and livelihoods and from their ecosystem, the rivers, the forest, and much of what nurtured their society and culture has been fundamentally altered actually. That has been a very important phenomenon that has happened. So when the Arjun Sengupta committee looked at the tribal situation as part of its report to the Prime Minister, classifies 88% of tribal people as poor and vulnerable. Now, it's an irony in a situation whereby most tribal people have access to lands, and they have access to the forest, they have access to the river most of the time because they lived closer to the environment. Now, a group of people across the country, who have had access to the lands and livelihoods and resources, natural resources, if they were to be classified as, 88% of them were to be classified as poor and vulnerable, I think we have a fundamental problem out there. The fundamental problem being that a systematic alienation of people from these resources and the resources that are being diverted to the other forms of development, where the tribal people are not part of the developmental processes, what you would call us as, that is the first problem. And secondly, they have not been party to whatever the decision that gets made. Basically, both 5th schedule and 6th schedule of the Constitution of India provides for the safeguarding the tribal culture, their language, and their lands and livelihoods. In fact, tribal lands cannot be alienated in that sense, and so is their access to and control over the environment in which they live. The community's consent is required if people were to be alienated from their lands and resources. In fact, the 1996 Panchayat extension to scheduled areas provides for safeguarding the culture and the language and the resources of the people, and none of the alienation can happen without the explicit expression of consent by the Gram Sabha, not any particular group of individuals, but the Gram Sabha, which is a larger ecosystem than a village or a hamlet. And that has been the intent of the PISA Act, which is codifying what the 5th schedule of the Constitution said, what the 6th schedule of the Constitution actually provided the people for. If you look at the 2006, the Forest Rights Act, it fundamentally alters the colonial forest law on its head. What is that? It transfers the ownership of forest resources and natural resources from that of the state to the community. And that is a fundamental change brought about by the 2006 Forest Rights Act for the tribal people actually. In other words, if you were to read the Forest Rights Act in consonance with the 5th schedule and the PISA, the tribal lands cannot be alienated, and in the process that tribal people's access to and control over their resources, and so their knowledge system cannot be alienated in this country. But what the state does is entirely different. This is where I would want to bring in the Niyamgiri case here. Niyamgiri case is the case of the primitive tribal groups, Kones, Dongria Kones and Kutia Kones, whose language doesn't count primarily because they are only 7,000 people. And they are primitive, but then they own the entire Niyamgiri Hills actually. When we talk to people, they would, families would show you those ranges I own. Now, that is the range they cultivate. And so they moved from one patch of the land to the another patch of the land because they cultivated they practiced the shifting cultivation. What happened in Niyamgiri case is that it is a Schedule 5 area, so PISA is applicable. It is governed by the Forest Rights Act. In other words, communities' right to the forest needed to be recognized first. In other words, the entire area where mining were to happen, the tribal people had access to and control over that land as such. Their rights needed to be recognized first, and their concern needed to be sought thereafter, and then only comes the situation whether the government can grant that land to mining or not. The government of Orissa says that it has implemented all acts. The Ministry of Environment and Forest said, it has followed the Forest Protection Act and Tribal Rights Act. The Supreme Court of India grants permission, asks the Ministry of Environment that mining can be allowed. Where all these institutions of the state had in its possession the knowledge and the information that none of the provisions of the Constitution relating to the tribal people were fulfilled. But all these institutions of the state grant permission to mine Niyamgiri Hills actually. So when our committee went in 2010, we didn't need to do any investigation at all because all investigation were done and it was out there actually. And the same institutions, excepting the Orissa government, the Ministry of Environment and Forest and the other institutions, held that since none of these rules and regulations have been followed, that this project cannot be allowed to go further. Now, what happens is that when you deal with tribal people, when you deal with people who are not integral part of what that they call it as a mainstream society, then they needed a protection, and that is what the Constitution and the legal and legislative measures provide the tribal people with. But when the state itself violates those norms, you have a problem, and that is exactly why you have a situation whereby 88% of the tribal people should be poor and vulnerable. The United Nations mandate on tribal people provides for their self-expression and their own self-regulation and independence actually. Tribal people are, by virtue of owning a distinct culture and identity, they have a right to self-determine their future. And in fact, PISA provides for that kind of self-determination, that it provides for prior informed consent on any decision that could be taken on their lands and livelihoods. The UN provides for, convention provides for the self-determination by the tribal groups because of their distinct identity. And irrespective of all that, you have a situation that has been reduced to tribal areas. And that's why you would find that is there a relationship between what has happened to the tribal people and the nature of extremism that you see out there? I think if you look at in the central India, the Schedule 5 areas, I think out of these about 90 districts in the Schedule 5 areas, about 66 districts are extremism affected areas as such, and it is expanding. Now, there could be a relationship between the nature of changes that has happened to the tribal people and their lands and livelihoods and language and culture, and the nature of extremism that has developed in these areas as such. First of all, tribal people have a right to the lands and livelihoods and their language and the culture. I think it is established by our constitution. It is provided by the UN Convention. They needed to be consulted and they need to be participate in decision-making processes. That their resources cannot be alienated without their expressed consent as such. But how do we learn to talk to our own people? How do we learn how do we listen to tribal people? How do we celebrate the diversity of culture and identity in this country and preserve their language, their tradition, their whole lot of value systems? I think these are the challenges that we are facing actually. So the economic fundamentalism of the state has also religious and linguistic fundamentalism that is attached to that actually. Throughout tribal belt, I think what is happening is also some form of transforming that into different belief system. I think this is again a dangerous phenomenon which we see in most of the tribal areas, is that they are being increasingly moved towards a different belief system, and if you don't belong here, there would be something else happening to people actually. So I think I would say that the state needs to respect and tolerate and able to permit its people to live in dignity and respect, and I think that is what is very important at this crucial juncture actually.